The other thing to really pay attention to is this idea of prompting and prompt fading. So prompting really simply is just about providing help. Whatever help you need to provide so that your child is successful in doing whatever it is you're trying to get your child to do. So you might use a physical prompt, right, where you physically help your child do something. You might use modeling. We've talked about that. You might use a visual prompt, and we'll look at some examples of that in a second. You might use gestures. You might use verbal prompts and tell your child. Lots of prompts, and they're very effective in terms of helping get your child to do what you want your child to do. The problem a lot of times, though, is that people start using prompts without having thought about how they're going to get rid of those prompts. And at some point, they end up where their child is doing lots of stuff, but only if prompted, okay? Maybe you have a spouse who's like this. Like your spouse only takes out the garbage or empties the dishwasher or does something if you ask, right? That's prompt dependency. That's all that is, okay? So what we want to do is avoid that situation. So before you start delivering prompts, you should be thinking about how you're going to fade those prompts away, right? And have a plan for it so that you don't end up in that situation. So we want to make sure that we fade prompts when they're no longer necessary. Keep performance going so that we have somebody who's independent in the end, okay? So let's look first at what some of those prompts look like. Then we'll talk a little bit about how to fade them away. So with physical prompts, we're talking about physical assistance, okay? And everybody provides physical assistance to their kid, especially little ones. It's how we teach them to do all kinds of things. So it might be a full physical prompt where it's sort of hand over hand. If you were teaching your child to use a spoon when they were wee little, you put the spoon in your child's hand and your hand over the child's hand and you helped them get food in their mouth, right? That was a hand over hand prompt. It was a physical prompt. If you're using an electric mixer, if you've ever used an electric mixer with a child, you definitely have used physical prompting because nobody just puts an electric mixer in the hand of a child and says, go for it. And if you do, you only do that once because it's usually pretty disastrous. So those are full physical prompts. We are sort of providing a lot of help. And then partial physical prompts are kind of things like tapping or nudging or sort of physically directing your child in the right direction when they need it. So maybe your child is learning to vacuum and they sort of stop the motion of pushing the vacuum and you kind of tap them on the arm to get them going again. Oh yeah, right, okay, I'm supposed to do this. Or maybe they're pouring water to water plants and they're pouring, and they're flooding the plant, and so you kind of like tap them to get them to stop doing that. That's a partial physical prompt. Or if they're mixing with the mixer, right? You might tap your child's hand if they start to lift the mixer out of the bowl and we're about to have an explosion. You kind of use a bit of a tap to remind them to keep their hand down. So those are partial physical prompts, okay? Now we talked about modeling already. Modeling is where we demonstrate the steps of a task, right? We might use live modeling where we show the child how to do the activity and they copy us. Or we use video modeling where we create a video that shows all the steps. Your child watches the video and then does the task. So that's modeling. We might use visual prompts. Visual prompts can be picture-based or text-based kinds of visual supports like we've already talked about, but they could also be positional prompts as well. So if you look at this, maybe you're teaching a child, either a really young child or maybe a child who has a more significant intellectual impairment, how to sort the silverware, okay? And right now, they're not making the visual discrimination very well, and they just put everything everywhere. And so maybe what we do is we sort of do the pre-sort. So now I'm going to give the child just the forks, and I'm going to cover all of the parts of the silverware drawer except for the forks. And so now there's only one hole to put the forks in, and they put the forks in because there's no discrimination needed. And then gradually I start to uncover things bit by bit. Okay, so those are positional prompts. If I'm teaching a child to put socks away and he hasn't yet really learned to discriminate individual drawers, I might open the sock drawer, leave it open, and then give my child the socks to put away. There's one open drawer. So that kind of provides a bit of a visual cue around what it is they're supposed to do. We can use gesture prompts, so things like pointing, things like nodding our head or shaking our head to give an indication as to whether or not somebody's doing what they should or shouldn't be doing. But if you think about pointing, maybe we've got a kid who's learning to make those discriminations between fork versus knife, etc. And so we point to where the fork goes, and then they put the fork away, right? And then we point to where the knife goes, and then they put the knife away. So maybe they need that extra point prompt to sort of help them figure out where they're supposed to put something. And then again, gradually over time, we're going to start to pull those points away so that they're looking at the silverware rather than just looking at where we're pointing, okay? We can also look at verbal prompts. So verbal prompts is just telling people, right? Tell your child what task to do. Tell your child how to do a specific part of a task. So that means your child needs to understand what you're saying and be able to follow instructions, okay? So lots of different ways that we can prompt. And remember that prompting is just about getting your child to do a task or a step of a task correctly. But the danger here is that if you prompt too much or too long, and you don't have a plan to fade those prompts away, you end up with someone who is prompt dependent and who doesn't do anything without essentially a personal invitation to do so, right? And help to do so. So that's not going to support or facilitate independence later on if we don't start to teach people to do things on their own. So it's really important that we start to fade those prompts away, okay? Verbal prompts especially can be difficult to fade away. It's difficult to sort of minimize your verbal prompts over time. So whenever possible, I try not to have people use a lot of verbal prompts other than typical delivery of instruction. It's time to do such and such, go do it, and no more, right? But pick up this, do this, turn that. I try not to use those kinds of verbal prompts a whole lot because they can be really difficult to pull away. If we're using things like physical prompts, we can gradually move our hands sort of from being hand over hand to sort of hand to elbow, hand to shoulder. We can sort of hover our hand around the child's hand, and if they start to go off track, we can bring them back to where they should be, but gradually start to just pull our bodies away and touch less and less. If we're thinking about the picture prompts or some of those sort of visual support-based things, those are the kinds of supports where even if we never fade those away, I'm not too concerned because a person can still go about doing a task, following a written checklist or a picture checklist, and not need another person to help them, right? I find that the older I get, the more I require those kinds of things myself. I still consider myself to be relatively independent, but I also can't remember as much as I used to. And so thank goodness I have this and other things where I can write information down to help me, okay? So at the end of the day, for the people that I work with, if I can get them to a point where they're independent in terms of no other person has to help them, but they're dependent on using a checklist or a schedule, I'm kind of okay with that, right? Again, it's like I can make cookies, but I still need to look at the recipe, right? There are lots of things that I'm quite competent at, but I have to look at the information as well, and I know how to look at the information, so I don't need another person to help me. And if you're thinking about this in terms of sort of adult services, again, think about, adult services often are significantly fewer than the services provided to children. There's less funding. You don't get as much staffing time. So as independent as people can be in terms of needing the support of other people, the better, because then you can use the limited funds and time for things where the person really needs help, as opposed to things that a person can kind of do for themselves if they have a checklist or a visual schedule or something like that, okay? But get those prompts out of there. Don't leave your child prompt dependent.